Chapter 10. Into the Woods. Harry arrived at the edge of the Pine Barrens just after 12 p.m. Giving himself one last pat down to ensure he had everything, he pulled out his map booklet, which helpfully included the known trails, and set off confidently toward the trail which would lead him, eventually, to the Blue Hole. That confidence received a stiff blow almost immediately, though, as Harry stepped into the forest. He felt a brief tingling sensation, and realized that it must be the effect of whatever it was about the Pine Barrens which made it impossible to apparate or portkey in or out. He quickly confirmed this theory by attempting, and failing, to apparate both outside of and deeper into the woods. So much for the emergency portkey, Harry muttered. This thought gave him significant pause. He had informed Remus and Sirius of his idea for the trip, and they had approved. However, he had not found out that portkeying and apparating would be impossible until after his conversation with his two quasi-guardians. It was entirely possible that they would not have approved, if they had been aware that his emergency portkey would not be of any use within the forest. Even he was suddenly uncertain if this was a good plan. I've escaped giant spiders in the Forbidden Forest, killed a basilisk with a sword, and dueled to the death an adult wizard possessed by Voldemort, Harry reasoned aloud. I'm sure I can handle a little camping trip in the woods. Confidence restored, Harry lit his wand with a murmured lumos, as the light within the forest was dim, even at noon, and strode onward. He did notice, however, that the wand light, though as bright as ever at his wand point, didn't seem to carry as far as it normally would. Harry chalked it up to being an effect of the substantial levels of ambient magic present throughout the Barrens. He theorized that it was likely that all spells would respond slightly unpredictably. Harry followed the trail, ducking through vines and stepping over fallen trees, for nearly 3 hours before stopping to rest. He sat for several minutes, sipping from his canteen and generally catching his breath, and then pulled out his map. After a glance, he sat up in surprise. The trail he was on, and which he had never left, had been significantly different from what was shown on the map. However, the trail ahead, at least the part that was in sight, seemed to match, curving in precisely the manner depicted. Could he be on the wrong trail, and this curve was just a coincidence? He decided to keep moving, and if the turns kept matching, he would assume he was on the right path, and if not, he would go back the way he came. That way, he'd be able to make it out before sundown. He moved on with a new sense of urgency. If it turned out that he was on the wrong trail, he wanted to know quickly, to begin his egress as soon as possible. However, these fears were soon calmed. The trail was clearly the same as was indicated on the map. Every time he looked back, though, the path seemed unfamiliar. Perhaps that was another odd effect of the magic which permeated the forest so deeply. Harry was briefly concerned about how he would get back, but a quick look at the map reassured him that there were several trails leading out of the forest from the Blue Hole. Even if a path was only viable once, he didn't have to take the same path back out again. If all else failed, he always had his firebolt. Around 7 p.m., the sun began to fall below the tree line, and Harry knew it was time to make camp for the night. Conveniently, he almost immediately found a likely-looking clearing off to the side of the path, and, with several flicks of his wand and a carefully controlled incendio, he soon had his tent erected and a roaring campfire burning. He completed his campsite with a Notice Me Not charm, a general aversion and repulsion charm, and a caterwauling charm. This way, no animals would notice his campsite, and if they came too close, they would be compelled to move away. Even if they made it through, the caterwauling charm would help to scare him off and alert Harry. Pleased with his preparations, he cast a finite on one of his boxed meals and sat down to eat. A hefty portion of fried chicken and biscuits, the kind served in the southern states, rather than dessert biscuits, which Americans referred to as cookies. Later, Harry looked at his progress on the map. It seemed that he was nearly to the Blue Hole. He would probably make it there before lunch tomorrow, and if all went well, he would be able to reach the edge of the Pine Barrens before nightfall. He put away the map, and took out his mirror, intending to update the marauders. Just before activating it, he realized that it would be well after midnight for them, and that they probably wouldn't appreciate being roused from much-needed rest just to hear that Harry was in the woods. Instead, he opened up Henry Earp's spellbook, and whiled away the rest of the evening practicing different dueling spells. When he took a break from his casting to take a drink, he looked at his watch, and was surprised to note that it was nearly 11 p.m. He decided to call it a night, doused the campfire, and went to bed, falling asleep as soon as he slid into his sleeping bag. He did not get to rest for very long. At precisely midnight, a horrible screeching scream, like the deep reverberations from tearing through corrugated cardboard, crossed with the sharp, shrill shriek of fingernails being dragged across a chalkboard, as though the very air itself was being ripped apart, in the distance shocked Harry out of his slumber. Wand out, his eyes, wide with surprise and fear, shot from side to side, trying to discern the direction from which the terrifying cry had come. Deep, empty silence settled upon the forest when the scream faded away. With a start, Harry suddenly realized that this was no different from before. Now that he noticed the silence, it occurred to him that he could not recall hearing or seeing any animals, magical or otherwise, since he had entered the Pine Barrens. How could he not have noticed it? No birds chirped, no insects buzzed, no squirrels or woodchucks chattered. At this realization, Harry was starkly aware that something about this forest was wrong, and he should have detected it the second he had set foot in this place. A profound sense of unease sunk into Harry's very bones. He would get no rest this night. Of that he was certain. As if agreeing with his thought, another, louder scream echoed through the woods. This time, a low rumbling roar, much like that of a lion, was layered under the other notes. It seemed to be further away, but as a precaution, Harry silently pulled on his socks and boots, and carefully zipped up his rucksack. He sat with his legs crossed beneath his body, ready to leap up, with his rucksack straps pulled tight across his chest. His wand in his right hand and his broom in his left, Harry waited, feeling like a submariner waiting out depth charges. The tension was almost unbearable as the minutes dragged on. A quarter of an hour later, the scream pierced the forest again, this time from much closer. It couldn't be more than a few dozen meters away, Harry thought, gripping his wand so tightly that his knuckles turned white, in sharp contrast to the dark ebony of his wand's wood. Then, his fear turned to terror, as he heard the sound of the bushes and saplings that lined the clearing being pushed aside, with fallen leaves and twigs crunching beneath the feet of something large and inevitably terrible. If it was within the clearing, then the creature had already passed through the aversion and repulsion charm. What if it was unaffected by the notice me not charm? Even worse, what if it was powerful enough to brush aside his charms entirely? His caterwauling charm, set inside the notice me not charm's perimeter, provided an answer when it was activated. As the klaxon sounded, Harry realized that the beast had defeated Harry's notice me not charm, and his decision was made. Reducto, Harry bellowed, blasting the tent apart. In the brief flash of light from his spell, Harry caught his first glimpse of the beast, and could not contain his scream of horror as his feet froze in place, refusing to obey his mind's command to run, move, run. The creature was truly monstrous. Its form was blurred, as though Harry's mind could not quite conceptualize what his eyes were reporting, but enough detail was perceptible that Harry instantly understood that it could not possibly exist naturally on this earth. It stood at least 8 feet tall upon powerful reverse-kneed legs ending in cloven hooves. Its forelimbs were disproportionately small, but were still much longer and thicker than Harry's arms, and its hands had 3 fingers tipped with long, wickedly curved talons. It held its large, leathery wings against its back, and its head was that of a ram, with heavy curled horns. The eyes, though, were by far the worst. They glowed red like hot coals, but held no warmth, instead promising nothing but pain and death. Its eyes flashed in the darkness, and it screamed again in literally incandescent rage as Harry turned and began to sprint away. He didn't know when he had begun to run, and he wasn't certain when he had lit his wand, but he quickly became certain that the now oppressive weight of the ambient magic of the Pine Barrens had rendered his firebolt inert, falling in a tangle of limbs and broomstick. He scrambled back to his feet and continued running, shrinking and stowing his firebolt as he tore down the path, all of his previous weariness buried beneath a veritable sea of adrenaline. After a few minutes of running, he realized that he might actually have the advantage. The path was narrow and winding, and the massive demon, for it could surely be nothing else, was too large to move easily through it, but not quite large enough to be able to plow through the trees. This hope was, of course, immediately dashed, as Harry heard another scream, this time from above him. Reflexes forged by a decade of dodging blows from Dudley and his gang, and honed to a razor edge by 3 years of dodging bludgers in Quidditch snapped into action, hurling Harry down onto his left side. The beast had, at some point during the chase, found enough room to spread its vast bat-like wings, and had crashed through the canopy to swoop down at Harry. He had barely dodged out of the way in time, and while the monster was picking itself up off the ground, having committed fully to the dive, it had plowed into the underbrush. Harry cast as powerful a cutting curse as he could muster at the beast's fallen form, striking one of its wings, and resumed his mad dash down the path as the demon roared in pain and fury. Harry continued running, never slowing his pace. His almost all-consuming fear was giving him all the stamina he needed. He stopped, stepped off the trail, and crouched down, trying to listen for the demon while he sipped from his canteen. After a tense minute of absolute silence, he heard the telltale sound of movement, and realized that the creature, having failed at a direct chase, was now stalking him. Harry got up and began moving again, casting a caterwauling charm on the trail. This way, he'd know how far behind him the creature was. He did this several more times, and had gone about 100 meters, before he heard the demon set off the first one. Continuing on, Harry soon came across a large clearing, dominated by a mostly circular lake approximately 30 meters wide. He could see the water's deep blue hue even in the darkness, despite the forest's limiting effect on his wand light. He shrugged. The beast had not set off the second caterwauling charm yet, so he had a bit of time. Why not at least get a bit of what he came for? Harry withdrew a glass jar, which he had charmed ahead of time for this precise purpose, and dunked it into the blue hole's water. The unbreakable jar filled quickly despite the space expansion charm laid into it. Thankfully, Harry had also layered on a featherweight charm, or else the volume of water, which was somewhere on the order of 600 liters, would have made the jar impossible for him to carry, and Harry closed the lid and put the jar back into his sack. As he withdrew the map to determine which alternate trail would lead him out of the forest, he heard the second caterwauling charm erupt. Harry quickly chose his route and set off at a brisk walk, knowing that the demon was now trying to tire him out rather than chase him down. That crash or his cutting curse must have done enough damage that it couldn't take to the air, or else the demon would already have been upon him again. Having concluded that it was tracking him by scent or some magical method, he realized that he had no hope of evading the demon indefinitely. He would either have to escape back to civilization, which would require leaving the barrens, or kill the beast. Knowing that he was at least several hours from the edge of the forest, especially since he had actually been running deeper into it, towards the blue hole, and was only now turning outward, he reluctantly reasoned that it was likely that he would end up having to fight the demon to the death. He considered the demon itself, and realized that it reminded him somewhat of a Dementor. Despite the fact that it had virtually nothing physically in common with that other foul creature, it also exuded an aura that had affected Harry acutely when it was close by. While Dementors ooze a sense of despair and sadness, this demon brought with it a distinct air of fear and wrongness. Maybe they were related, he thought, hope blooming in his chest for the first time since midnight. Harry knew that Letherfolds were distant relatives of Dementors, and they were just as affected by the Patronus charm as Dementors were. Perhaps it would also work on this creature. However, it seemed somewhat more solid than a Dementor. While a Patronus was sufficient to chase off a Dementor for quite some time, it might not be enough to stop this monster. I don't need the Patronus to stop it entirely, he mused aloud. If the Patronus distracts it, maybe I can kill it some other way. Most wizards would immediately turn to their thoughts to their wand. Harry, however, had killed 2 opponents without his wand while still a child, instead using his bare, albeit sacrifice-based blood protection imbued, hands to kill Quirrell and a sword to kill a massive basilisk. So, taking a quick inventory of his equipment, he found that he still possessed the daggers that Sirius had made him take from the Black family armory. If it was too hurt to fly, he reasoned, perhaps that meant that it could bleed. And if it could bleed, that meant it had a heart. Setting his jaw grimly, Harry drew the longest of the daggers, the runes engraved into the blade glinting dangerously in the dim light. This should do the job, Harry concluded, picturing where the creature's heart must be. This should definitely do the job. Chapter 11. One for the history books. Chapter 11. One for the history books. Disclaimer, standard stuff, I don't own anything, I won't be making profit, any resemblance to previously published content is purely coincidental, J.K. Rowling is the coolest, etc. If I make any legal errors regarding copyrighted material, inform me and I will correct them immediately. Harry Potter and the Lightning Scar. Harry sat back, frowning. There were other preparations he would have liked to make, though he would have preferred not to have to make them in the first place. But the demon had just set off the nearest caterwauling charm, and Harry was out of time. What he had would simply have to be enough. Harry's ambush was set up just after a narrow blind corner in the trail, surrounded by large boulders, likely migrated somehow from the nearby Appalachian Mountains, covered in some sort of moss. The trail, though, was still simple dirt, and so Harry had blasted a pit into the ground, about 5 feet deep. He had used cutting hexes to trim about a dozen branches into sharpened stakes, and lined the bottom of the pit with them. The pit was covered by a large dirt-covered steel plate, which he had transfigured from a leaf, onto which he had kicked enough dirt to conceal its presence. Hearing the beast just around the corner, Harry stepped off the path, and waited, not daring even to breathe, as the demon stepped into the dim moonlight. He barely managed to stifle his gasp of horror at what he saw. The demon's eyes were ablaze with fury and hatred, and he felt its malevolent gaze burn into his own fearfully widened eyes. The demon moved forward slowly and deliberately, shaking the ground with each step. Then, with a pair of ringing clangs, the huge hooves hit the steel plate. This was the moment Harry had been waiting for. "Finite," Harry whispered, pointing his wand at the steel plate, which promptly turned back into a small leaf. However, the beast had already moved past the plate-covered pit. Harry had missed his chance. Time for Plan B. Harry stood defiantly before the huge demon and pointed his ebony wand directly between the beast's fiery eyes, enduring its scream of impending triumph. Dredging up every good memory he had, thinking back to Sirius and Remus and the feelings they brought, of home, happiness, family, love. Expecto Patronum. Harry bellowed. His wand arm bucked with recoil, as though he had just fired a shotgun one-handed, and a massive, glowing silver stag slammed into the demon's chest, expending all of its energy in a flash of silver and a concussion that shook leaves from the trees. The creature let out a "woof" of surprise as it was pushed backwards, and then it tumbled into the now open pit, impaling itself on the sharpened stakes. Its piercing shriek of pain and rage, though, let Harry know that it was not quite finished. Looking down at the beast, he could see that its arms, legs, and wings were impaled by the stakes. However, having such a long and flexible neck, it would still be able to bite him with its fangs. Harry didn't bother to stop and wonder why a ram-headed creature had fangs. Of course it had fangs, because it just wouldn't be horrible enough without them. Incarcerous, Harry incanted, watching as the monster was completely immobilized, and, thankfully, gagged, by thick ropes. Just to be certain that it could not rip through the ropes, he also cast a quick Petrificus Totalis before vanishing the stakes. Harry lowered himself into the pit with another conjured rope tied around a tree, holstered his wand and drew the long, cold iron dagger. He looked the brute in the eyes, which still glowed, promising vengeance, before slamming the blade into the demon's chest. Seconds later, the beast's eyes faded to featureless black orbs, and Harry knew that it was finally dead. "Huh," he said aloud. "Now what?" Usually his misadventures ended with him waking up at the hospital wing, with Madame Pomfrey force feeding him potions. Now, though, he still had to make his way out of the woods before he could apparate back to the inn. It almost felt anticlimactic, he thought, though perhaps that was the hallmark of a successful ambush. No long, drawn-out battle, just a few cheap shots and a dead monster. Frowning at the thought, he transfigured the dead demon into a large bone, deciding that perhaps the researchers at the Franklin Institute might want to study it, and cast a Scourgify to clean the black, syrupy blood off of the dagger and his hands. "Might as well get going," he muttered, and set off down the trail. 5 extremely uneventful hours later, the sun rose upon a dirty, sweaty, exhausted Harry Potter stumbling out of the woods, feeling suddenly lighter as the oppressive weight of the forest's magic lifted off of him. Without a second thought, save for an overwhelming sense of relief, he apparated back to his room at the inn, and didn't even make it to the bed before pitching over and passing out. "Ow!" Harry yelped, rubbing the back of his head. "What the hell, Hedwig?" His owl looked at him sternly, then raised a wing to point roughly at the alarm clock, which showed 9 a.m., July 3rd Road. He had slept for more than an entire day. Yeah, I'm up," he muttered, dragging himself to his feet and staggering to the shower. He emerged at just about 10 a.m., finally feeling clean now that he had scrubbed every bit of his skin several times. Harry considered for a moment the events of the weekend, and decided to write to Healer Hopkins for advice on who, if anyone, at the Franklin Institute might be interested in hearing about his encounter with a monster in the Pine Barrens. "Hedwig, I'll have a letter for you as soon as I'm done eating everything I can get my hands on," he said, not really exaggerating. He was unbelievably hungry, as he had not eaten for over 36 hours, and had spent a not insignificant portion of that time running from and battling an unholy abomination. Edward Hopkins was an accomplished man, and one of the most well-known of the researchers at the Franklin Institute. Like many in his family, he had an eye toward improving life, and therefore had focused much of his research on the healing arts, even taking the time to receive a medical degree from the prestigious university that bore his famous ancestor's name. Therefore, it was no surprise that he received a great deal of correspondence from colleagues and researchers around the globe, and, after decades of consulting on a wide variety of cases, considered himself somewhat desensitized to shock. He was taken aback, though, by the content of a short missive from a child he vaguely recalled meeting the previous week. So much so that he interrupted his lunch and called perhaps the one researcher at the Institute more well-known, and with a more famous family name, than himself. Moments later, a tall, powerfully built man with a square jaw, black hair, and grey eyes stepped through the fire into Edward's home. "Good afternoon, Jacob," Edward said, shaking the man's hand. Jacob Crane was, like his great-great-grandfather Ichabod, a monster hunter, and his experience had already added several chapters to the next edition of On Combating the Darker Forces of This Earth and Beyond. He was considered an expert in all matters related to dark creatures and magical combat, and had been extremely interested in what Edward had mentioned in the short fire call. "Thanks for the call, Ed," Crane said. "Do you think it might be true?" "Maybe," Hopkins allowed. "I recall that the boy was British. It's likely he hasn't heard of the Jersey Devil, so he wouldn't think to try to make some sort of hoax centered around it. Here, take a look at the letter. Dear Healer Hopkins. I don't know if you recall, but you spoke to me several days ago at the Franklin Institute about some interesting fields of magic and courses of study I might undertake in my spare time, and prescribed me some nutrient potions to correct malnourishment. Anyway, I went on a camping trip to the Pine Barrens on Friday, and encountered some sort of demon in the forest which might need to be brought to the attention of the authorities or, at least, someone in the field of dark creatures. Would you, or anyone you know of at the Institute, be interested in hearing my account of the encounter? If so, please send a reply with my owl. I will be departing the city on the 5th of July, so, in light of the holiday tomorrow, today would be the best opportunity to discuss what happened. Regards, Harry Potter." Crane let out a low whistle. "This could be the real deal, you know," he said, unable to keep the excitement from his voice. "Maybe this kid saw something that will show us how to kill those damn things." 30 minutes and 2 more owl messages later, the two men were knocking on the door to Harry's room at the Alexander Inn, and were promptly ushered inside by a pale, dark-haired teenager. The three wizards stood in an awkward silence, until Hopkins broke the ice. "It looks like those nutrient potions are working well for you," he observed. "Seems like you've grown at least 3 or 4 inches, and put on about 10 pounds. Have you noticed an increase in appetite?" Harry smiled gratefully, and blushed slightly at the attention. "Yes, sir, and thank you very much for telling me the potions I need to take. Now that I've had time to think about this weekend, I think they also helped my stamina, which probably saved my life on Friday night." This statement snapped Crane's attention back to the boy, which reminded Hopkins that he had brought Crane along. "This is Jacob Crane, an expert in dark creatures," he said. Recognition flashed in Harry's eyes. "I've been reading your family's text on fighting dark creatures," he said. This was a new wrinkle, Crane thought. Depending on the edition, it was indeed possible that the young man had in fact heard of the Jersey Devil. "What edition have you been reading, and how far in have you gotten?" he asked casually. "The 1988 edition, and I'm halfway through the 12th chapter," Harry replied. Crane cocked an eyebrow and shared a significant look with Hopkins. The 1988 edition was the most recent edition of the text, and both men were aware that the section on demons and devils began in the 13th chapter. "Open it up to chapter 13, Crane instructed, and skim through to where it mentions the northeastern United States." He watched the boy's eyes scan across the page, and suddenly go wide. "This is what I saw," Harry whispered, his face even more pale. "It was terrible." Harry recounted his tale. When he reached his reasoning about the Patronus, Crane was skeptical. "You can cast a corporeal Patronus?" In answer, a glowing silver stag cantered around the room before dissolving into glittering motes of light, quashing any further doubt. As the argent light faded, Harry continued his tale through to the end, leaving both older men in shocked silence. Finally, Ed Hopkins found his voice, and asked for the bone. Harry drew it from his pocket, tossed it to him. You should step back before dispelling the transfiguration, Harry warned. It's at least 8 feet tall, and its wingspan is twice that. A flick of Crane's wand proved the truth of Harry's claim, as the demon's corpse, in all its slightly blurry malevolence, took up all of the available space in the room. As Hopkins blanched, Crane transfigured it back into a bone and sat down heavily. Harry, would it be possible for you to come to the Institute and give us a copy of your memory of the fight with this devil? We could leave now, and it would only take a few minutes. Harry agreed, and, after a brief explanation of the function of a pensieve, went to Crane's office at the Institute and provided the memory of the fight. The three then experienced the memory, Harry, of course, for the second time, which Harry narrated. Afterward, it was nearing dinner time, so they adjourned to the Institute's cafeteria and continued their discussion over steaks and butterbeer. Harry, Crane said, I can't overstate how much your efforts will help us understand how better to hunt these beasts down. With your permission, I'd like to include your story in next edition of my family's book. I originally wanted to begin printing this summer, but with this new information, the Jersey Devils might all be hunted down in a few months, so I'll probably push it to the beginning of next year. Harry was reluctant to get more famous, but he figured that at least this time it would be for something he actually remembered doing. Plus, it wasn't as though anyone in Britain read American publications, viewing non-European wizards as beneath them. He agreed, and posed for a picture standing next to the slain devil, with his wand in one hand and his trusty dagger, which had not left his reach since he had used it to kill the creature, in the other. I'll send you the wording on the section later this summer, so you can add in and make sure everything is accurate, Crane said happily. And after you are done in Wisconsin, you'll have a few weeks before you go back to Britain. If you want, you can spend that time with my department, and we'll teach you a few things. Harry enthusiastically agreed to these terms. Only a madman would turn down lessons from a team of dark creature hunters at one of the most prestigious research institutions in the country. After a quick eye exam from healer Hopkins, who told him that he would likely regain most or all of his eyesight, and who told him to keep in contact about his condition, and handshakes from both men, Harry apparated back to the inn. After all, he had a mirror call to make. Chapter 12, Independence Day. Harry awoke on Monday, July 4th to the sound of revelry in the street below. Crowds were already gathering throughout the city for the parades, tours, and general merrymaking in the spirit of independence from Britain. Harry would have been more inclined to join in the masses of star-spangled humanity, but was still somewhat recovering from the blazing tongue-lashing that Sirius and Remus had given him the night before. Somehow, starting out the conversation with, "Before you get too mad, let me first point out that I'm still alive," had failed to blunt their fury, especially when he was forced to recount all of the times during the adventure that he should have taken as signs to retreat. It had gotten worse after Harry had let slip the general contents of Chapter 13 of On Combating the Darker Forces of This Earth and Beyond regarding the Jersey Devil and its hunting habits. According to Crane, the Jersey Devil preferred to eat its prey by scooping out and eating all of the internal organs while its prey was still alive, apparently because whatever hell had spawned it had somehow decided that everything else about that demon was not quite horrible enough already. This revelation alone would have led to Harry being recalled to London, if Sirius and Remus had been available to keep watch over him. As they were busy hunting Pettigrew, though, they simply established a new rule regarding any side trips that Harry wanted to go on. Specifically, he had to thoroughly research any dangers associated with a prospective destination, and then convince the two older men that he would be able to keep himself safe. This new restriction did not bother Harry, as he had already resolved to be more cautious. It was abundantly clear to him that he was quite alone here, and he wouldn't always have anyone watching his back. He would do his best to avoid the darker places in America, which in many cases were more dangerous and savage than those of Britain. It did hurt, however, that the incident appeared to have damaged the trust that Sirius and Remus had for his judgment. His thoughts coming back to the present, Harry, with a few helpful pecks on the back of the head from Hedwig, got out of bed, and began his last day in Philadelphia, as he would be port-keying to Wisconsin after lunch the next day, with bacon and eggs from the inn's breakfast buffet, before turning his attention to the Crane text. His appetite for excitement still had not quite recovered from the events of the weekend, and he was also still nursing several cuts and bruises from the mad dash through the woods. He spent the next several hours in his room, reading and practicing utility-type spells, as the setting was obviously inappropriate for practicing combat spells. It was not until he broke for lunch that he felt any inclination to venture outside. At roughly 12:30 p.m., Harry walked the short distance to Chinatown, and had lunch at a small restaurant. As he washed down his lunch special number 13 with a can of root beer, and obviously magical, easily identifiable by the way the eyes tended to slide past it, if not by the store's name, Pet Shop caught his eye. He paid for his meal, tipping generously, and walked across the street to the Philadelphia Magical Animal and Pet Supply Company. The 19th century styling of the building was not unique in the city, but it stood out in Chinatown, even compared to other shops serving the magical community. The ting of a bell on the door announced Harry's entrance into the store, and he took a quick glance around. It was at least thrice the size of the magical menagerie on Diagon Alley, where Hermione had purchased Crookshanks. The selection also appeared to be more diverse, and signs posted around the store proclaimed that, upon request, orders could be placed for creatures not normally in stock. It was somewhat cleaner than its British counterpart, and several attendants scurried about, feeding the animals and speaking to customers. Harry passed the owl aisle, as Hedwig was more than sufficient for his postage needs, and a rather faithful pet as well, and avoided the monkey cages altogether, as their simian faces reminded him rather unnervingly of the statue of Salazar Slytherin in the Chamber of Secrets. Plus, he didn't quite fancy spending all of his time running around Gryffindor Tower apologizing for whatever disgusting mischief a pet monkey would inevitably perpetrate. He also bypassed the cages of cats and rats, having been put off both creatures entirely in the past year, the former by Hermione's nigh psychotic half-Kneazle, and the latter by Pettigrew's treachery. He soon came upon a series of terrariums containing amphibians and reptiles. There were frogs and toads, ranging in size from an inch up to well over a foot in length. Some purportedly had powers that would put Neville's toad Trevor to shame, as his only magical power seemed to be his uncanny ability to escape from Neville. As soon as Harry's eyes came to rest on the snakes, though, he knew that he would almost certainly be leaving the store with one of them, as his mind blazed through the arguments in favor of and against such a companion. On the one hand, magical Britain almost universally considered snakes to be untrustworthy, and those with the ability to speak to them were often painted as potential Dark Lords. On the other hand, it was already a matter of public record that Harry was a Parselmouth, so there was little left to lose on that front. Also, a pet with which he could actually exchange conversation would be excellent. As much as he loved Hedwig, she couldn't talk to him, and Harry was, in general, quite lonely. The idea of having a friend that he wouldn't have to share with anybody else, therefore, appealed to him greatly. Perhaps most importantly was that having a snake would be a statement. Harry was a Parselmouth, and he didn't care what anyone else thought about it, because he was done proving over and over again that he was not a dark wizard. Harry looked at him, trying to decide which to choose. There were a few cobras, a black mamba, and a boa constrictor, all hissing at him to choose them over the others. However, one snake in the back of the large terrarium stood out. The dark, distinctively patterned diamondback rattlesnake, the only snake not practically begging to be chosen and fed fat mice, raised up its triangular head, and stared into Harry's eyes. "Do you not wish to be chosen, Rattlesnake?" Harry asked in Parseltongue, quietly enough that none of the other customers or attendants could hear. Every snake immediately all fell silent. It was almost unheard of for a human to be able to speak their language. After a long silence, the snake answered. "I know what I can offer you," it hissed. "I can slither unseen, guard your secrets, and kill your enemies. You have not made any offer to me." Harry stared back into the snake's eyes. "You have a steady supply of food here, but I can let you hunt. You have a warm rock here, but I can offer you the sun. And you have glass walls here, but I can offer you freedom. All I require is your loyalty." There was another long silence before the rattlesnake lowered its head in a sort of bow of submission, and gave its reply. "You will have it, master." "Do you have a name, snake?" Harry asked. "Snakes have no use for names, except with humans," it replied. "If you are to be my master, it is for you to name me." "Come with me," Harry said. "And I will give you hunting, the sun, freedom, and a name." Harry smiled, lifted the lid of the terrarium, and allowed the rattlesnake to slither up onto his shoulders. He drew numerous incredulous stares from other customers, and even the cashier who took his money looked more than a little unsettled. Harry didn't care. As he walked out of the store, his thoughts turned to the flag he had seen at Independence Hall, just before leaving for the Pine Barrens the previous Friday afternoon. It was ironic, he thought, that an Englishman in Philadelphia on the 4th of July should choose the first symbol of independence from Britain as his companion. Despite that, the same symbol was an accurate way to describe the entire underlying purpose for his trip to America. On the surface, of course, he was here to learn to be an animagus. However, that was just an expression of the true reason for the trip, which was to allow him to get out from beneath the yoke of Dumbledore and the Dursleys, spread his wings, and breathe free air for once. With a crack, he was back in his hotel room. He put the rattlesnake down on the armchair in front of the window, where it promptly coiled up and hummed, clearly enjoying the way the sun's rays warmed its scales. Finally, he broke the silence that he had been holding while thinking such weighty thoughts. "I have decided," Harry hissed. "Your name is Gadsden." Harry spent the remainder of the afternoon catching Gadsden up on his life back in Britain, and the plans for the summer. By the time Gadsden was up to speed, it was time for dinner. For Harry, this meant pizza and a Coke, while Hedwig and Gadsden each got a live mouse. Harry was glad that Gadsden had let the mouse run around for a while before hunting it down and killing it. If he had had to listen to its hissed exclamations of delight about the squishy juicy mousey, while he had been eating, he would have lost his appetite. After dinner, Harry went outside, following the tide of people towards the good viewing areas to see the fireworks display. Once he arrived, he apparated to the roof of a nearby building, to have a better view, just in time for the opening salvo. Amid bursts of color and blasts of sound, set to renditions of several popular and famous American songs, including the national anthem, Harry spent the better part of the evening basking in the glow of the fireworks. Around 10 p.m., by then thoroughly impressed by the show, but too weighed down by fatigue to stay out any longer, he apparated back to his room, brushed his teeth, and crawled into bed, falling asleep nearly the moment his head hit the pillow.